Fort Worth has a slogan carved into its identity: where the West begins. The city built an entire brand on it: cattle drives, stockyards, cowboy hats, the works. But the 98th Meridian, the line that actually separates the humid East from the arid West, runs east of Fort Worth. It cuts straight through the middle of the Cotton Bowl in Dallas, and a misplaced meridian is the least of it. This city is named after a general who never set foot here. It was abandoned by the Army after 4 years, and the ground it sits on hadn't moved in 70 million years, until we started drilling. Pull up a map of Texas and draw a vertical line at 98 degrees west, and you'll watch Fort Worth's entire brand fall apart in about 3 seconds. That line is the one historian Walter Prescott Webb made famous: the place where the wet, wooded, farmable East gives way to the dry, treeless, hardscrabble West. It's not a border on any map you'd buy at a gas station. It's a rainfall line. East of it, you can plant crops and expect rain. West of it, you'd better own a windmill and a lot of patience. Webb argued that crossing it changed everything about how people lived, what they built, and how they thought. And that line does not run through Fort Worth. It runs about 30 miles east, through Dallas, specifically right through Fair Park, through the middle of the Cotton Bowl, the stadium where the Red River rivalry gets played every October. If you take the geography literally, the West begins in the end zone of a football stadium in Fort Worth's oldest rival city. Fort Worth is, by that measure, an eastern town. Humid, wooded, wetter than the country it claims to introduce. So sit with that for a second. The most famous cowboy city in America built its identity on a boundary that doesn't touch it, which raises the obvious question. If the West doesn't begin here, then what exactly is this place? Why did anyone build a town on this particular bluff at all? The answer starts with a man who never once saw it. There is a statue, a square, and a city of nearly 1 million people named after William Jenkins Worth, and he never stood on any of it. Worth was a genuine hero of the Mexican-American War, a career officer who had fought his way through Monterrey and Mexico City and come home with a reputation. In 1849, he was commanding the Department of Texas, and he laid out a plan for a chain of forts to guard the frontier settlements. Then, in May of that year, cholera swept through San Antonio, and Worth died of it. He was 55. The post on the Trinity River was established a few weeks later. He was already dead. He had never seen the site, never approved the location, never issued an order about it. His name was attached the way names get attached, as a memorial by men who had served under him. The officer who actually ordered the outpost into existence was Brigadier General William S. Harney, Worth's replacement. The man who chose the ground was Major Ripley Arnold, riding out with a company of the 2nd Dragoons to find a defensible spot. He picked a bluff above the point where the Clear Fork and the West Fork of the Trinity River come together, and he picked it for boring, practical reasons. Water below, timber nearby, high ground for visibility, and a breeze coming across the bluff, which in a North Texas summer is not a luxury, it's a medical necessity. Even the local folklore gets it wrong. Ask around Fort Worth and someone will tell you the place started as Camp Worth before it was upgraded to a fort. That's a nice story. There was a Camp Worth. It was in San Antonio, a completely different post. The Trinity River outpost was Fort Worth from the beginning. So the city is named for a stranger, cited by a major nobody remembers, and remembered through a piece of trivia that isn't true. And the fort itself? It barely lasted long enough to matter. Fort Worth was a military failure, and that failure is the only reason the city exists. The post was established on June 6, 1849, one of 8 forts strung in a rough line from the Rio Grande up to the Red River. The idea was a defensive wall against raids on the frontier settlements, and Fort Worth specifically did almost nothing. No major battle was ever fought there. No campaign was launched from it. Soldiers drilled, cut wood, got sick, and waited for something that mostly didn't come. Here's the problem with a defensive line on a moving frontier. The frontier moves. Within 4 years, settlement had pushed roughly 100 miles further west, and the fort was suddenly sitting in the middle of settled country, guarding nothing from nobody. So on September 17, 1853, the army packed up and left. That should have been the end of it. Abandoned frontier posts usually rot back into the landscape. A few chimney stacks, a foundation line, a historical marker somewhere off a farm road. Except the settlers stayed. And more than that, they moved in. Families took over the empty barracks. The officers' quarters became houses. The commissary became a store. A hotel opened in one of the old buildings. People were living inside a decommissioned federal installation because the buildings were already standing and nobody was using them. Think about what that means. Most American cities were founded, surveyed, platted, sold, incorporated. Fort Worth was squatted. The city exists because a group of civilians looked at a failed government project and decided the roof was still good. Quick one before we go on, because I'm curious where you land on this. Historians genuinely can't agree on where the West starts. Some say the 98th Meridian, some say the 100th, and some say it's the Balcones Fault down through central Texas. Tell me in the comments which line you'd actually draw. Everything you picture when you hear Fort Worth arrived almost 20 years after the fort itself died. The cattle didn't start moving until 1867. That's when the Chisholm Trail opened up, running from South Texas north toward the railheads in Kansas, and Fort Worth happened to sit right on it, the last town of any size before the crossing into Indian Territory. If you were a trail boss, this was your final chance to buy flour, replace a horse, get a wagon wheel fixed, and let your men blow off 2 months of accumulated pressure before the hard part started. Over the next 17 years, something like 5 million head of cattle and 1 million Mustangs came up that trail. It is by most counts the largest movement of livestock in human history. And Fort Worth sat there like a toll booth on the whole thing, taking a cut of every outfit that passed. The town leaned in hard. Saloons, gambling houses, dance halls, and a red light district so notorious it got its own nickname, Hell's Half Acre. The nickname Cowtown stuck. Later came the stockyards, the packing plants, the rodeo, and eventually the twice-daily Longhorn Drive down Exchange Avenue that tourists film on their phones today. But look at the sequence. The fort failed. The settlers squatted. Then a cattle trail happened to run past the front door, and the town grabbed that identity with both hands and sold it to the world. That's the pattern. Fort Worth does not inherit an identity. It adopts one, and then it markets that identity harder than anybody else, which is a genuinely useful skill for a city to have. It's also, as you're about to see, an extremely effective disguise. There is a light bulb in Fort Worth that has been switched on since Teddy Roosevelt was president. On September 21st, 1908, an electrician named Barry Burke was getting the brand new Byers Opera House ready for opening night. The backstage door was badly lit, so he screwed 3 carbon filament bulbs into the rafters above it. 2 of them eventually burned out. The third one didn't. It just kept going. The Opera House became the Palace Theater. Silent films came and went. Talkies arrived. The building outlived its neighbors and was finally torn down in 1977. And by then the bulb had become a local legend, with signs posted warning people not to touch the switch. A man named George Dado bought it, carried it home, and kept it lit. In 1991, it moved into a glass case at the Stockyards Museum, where it burns today, dimmed down to preserve it. Guinness recognizes it as the second longest burning bulb on Earth, behind only a firehouse bulb in Livermore, California. It's a charming little miracle. It's also, in a strange way, the whole city in miniature, something quietly extraordinary, sitting in a room full of cowboy hats that almost nobody comes to see. Now here's the version of that pattern with actual stakes. Take a bill out of your wallet and look at the front, lower, right of the portrait. If you see 2 small letters, F and W, that money was printed in Fort Worth. Since 1991, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing has run a second facility out on Blue Mound Road, a fortress of a building where something on the order of 19 million notes come off the presses every single day. In recent years, roughly 60% of all US paper currency has been printed there. There are only 2 places on Earth where American money is legally made, and one of them is in Cowtown. So, a light bulb from 1908 and most of the nation's cash supply. One is charming, one is serious infrastructure. And the third thing hiding under the cowboy hat is the reason Soviet planners knew this city by name. In 1942, on the western edge of town, the federal government built a mile-long building, and Fort Worth stopped being a cattle town without ever admitting it. Air Force Plant 4 went up on the prairie next to Lake Worth, and Consolidated Aircraft moved in to build B-24 Liberators for the war. Thousands of workers poured in. Ranch hands became riveters. Women who had never held a factory job were suddenly assembling bombers on a line that ran for what felt like forever. The building was so long that workers rode bicycles from one end to the other. But the war ended and the plant didn't. What came next was bigger, literally. Consolidated, later Convair, started building the largest American warplane ever made, the B-36. The numbers on this thing are hard to hold in your head. A wingspan of 230 feet, longer than the Wright brothers' entire first flight. 6 piston engines mounted backwards, pushing instead of pulling, plus 4 jet engines bolted on later. Crews slept in bunks on missions that could run more than 30 hours. It was so big that crawling from the front pressurized compartment to the rear, one meant lying on a wheeled trolley and pulling yourself through a tunnel over the bomb bays. The prototype flew out of Fort Worth on August 8, 1946. Between then and 1954, 385 of them rolled out of that building. A town that had spent 70 years selling itself as the last stop before the frontier had become, in under a decade, the place where America built its heaviest bombers. And nothing about the marketing changed at all. Here's the part that should genuinely stop you. For several years in the 1950s, Fort Worth was one of the most strategically important pieces of real estate in the Western Hemisphere. The B-36 wasn't just big. It was until the B-52 came online, the only American aircraft capable of carrying first-generation thermonuclear weapons. Bombs measured not in kilotons but in megatons, 5 to 20 of them, from airfields inside the United States all the way to targets inside the Soviet Union and back. No forward bases required. No refueling stop that a hostile government could deny. That single capability is what made the entire American nuclear posture credible in the early Cold War. And every one of those aircraft came out of one building on the west side of Fort Worth, Texas. Which means that in Soviet targeting doctrine, this was not a cattle town. It was a node. If the strategic bombers came from Fort Worth, then Fort Worth is where you stop them, on the ground before they ever take off. Any serious first strike plan against the United States in that era had to account for a mile-long factory sitting between a lake and a stockyard. So picture the actual 1950s in this city. Downtown, the Chamber of Commerce is printing brochures about cattle drives. Out at the stockyards, they're running rodeos. Eamon Carter, the city's greatest promoter, is walking around in a 10-gallon hat telling anyone who'll listen that this is where the West begins. And 8 miles west, behind a fence, workers are assembling the delivery system for hydrogen bombs. That is the single strangest contradiction in this entire story. The most aggressively folksy city in Texas was a link in the nuclear chain, and it never once put that on a postcard. The remarkable thing isn't that the plant built the B-36. It's that the plant never stopped. The same floor that turned out peacemakers went on to build the F-111. Then, starting in the 1970s, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, the most widely produced Western fighter jet of the modern era, flown by dozens of air forces around the world. And today, under Lockheed Martin, that building produces the F-35 Lightning II, the aircraft the United States and most of its allies are betting the next 40 years on. Line that up and the record is genuinely hard to match. For more than 80 years, without a meaningful gap, Fort Worth has continuously manufactured America's frontline combat aircraft. Not components, not subassemblies, finished airframes rolling out the door and into squadron service. There are cities that built one famous weapon. There are cities that had one great industrial decade. Very few places anywhere have stayed at the tip of the spear across the piston age, the jet age, the stealth age, and now the software-defined age. And none of them are a city this size. Generations of Fort Worth families have worked in that building. Grandparents on B-36 wings, parents on F-16 fuselages, kids on F-35 assembly. It's a company town in the way Pittsburgh was a steel town, except almost nobody outside North Texas thinks of it that way. Go looking through Fort Worth's tourism marketing for any of this and you'll find almost nothing. The cattle drive is on the front page. The fighter jets are not. Worth and Dallas disliked each other so intensely that the federal government eventually had to force them to share an airport, and the thing they built outgrew the legal system. The rivalry is old and it is real. Dallas got the railroads first, Dallas got the banks, Dallas got the skyline and the reputation, and Fort Worth got called the place where the East peters out. For decades, each city ran its own airport and refused to give ground until federal regulators essentially told them, build one together or neither of you gets service. What came out of that shotgun marriage opened in 1974, and the scale of it is faintly ridiculous. DFW International covers more than 17,000 acres, a footprint larger than the island of Manhattan. It sprawls across 2 counties and touches 4 separate cities. You can drive for 10 minutes inside the airport property without seeing a terminal. They built the thing. What they did not do was settle who actually governed it. Ownership, taxing authority, zoning power, and control over expansion were left in a genuine tangle, and every time the airport tried to grow, somebody sued. The disputes escalated through the courts for years, and it eventually took a 1994 United States Supreme Court decision to sort out the mess. Read that back. 2 cities hated each other so much that resolving their compromise required the highest court in the country. The rivalry didn't just build an airport, it built one that broke the law's ability to describe it. And all of that is happening on the surface. Underneath it, something much older was about to wake up. Go down about 1.5 miles beneath Fort Worth, and you hit one of the most valuable rock formations in North America. It's called the Barnett Shale, a dense black layer holding an estimated 55 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. This is where the modern shale boom actually started, not Pennsylvania, not North Dakota. Here, in the 1990s and early 2000s, where a company called Mitchell Energy spent years failing to make hydraulic fracturing work in shale, and then finally cracked it. What followed was extraordinary and a little surreal. Roughly 14,000 wells went in across a play covering some 5,000 square miles. And more than 1,000 of those wells are inside Fort Worth city limits, under parking lots, behind sound walls at shopping centers, on church property, tucked beside apartment complexes. There are cities that sit near a gas field. Fort Worth sits on one at metro density, which is close to unique among major American cities. Now, here's the part that matters for what comes next. Before all that drilling started, the Fort Worth Basin was seismically dead. Not quiet, dead. There was no historical record of earthquakes here at all. When geologists looked at the faults buried beneath the basin and worked out when they had last moved on their own, the answer came back at roughly 70 million years ago. 70 million. The last time this ground shifted by itself, there were dinosaurs walking around on top of it. This is stable rock in the most literal sense available. It does not move. Moved on October 30th, 2008. On Halloween Eve, 2008, people across the DFW area called 911 to report loud booms and shaking walls. A lot of them assumed something had exploded. Nothing had exploded. The ground was moving, for the first time in recorded history in that basin. Seismologists from SMU and the University of Texas rushed instruments into the field, and the pattern they found was hard to look away from. About 7 weeks before the shaking started, a wastewater disposal well had begun operating on Dallas-Fort Worth Airport property. Pumping produced fluids from gas operations deep underground into the Ellenberger Formation. The earthquake cluster sat less than a mile from that well. There was a mapped fault running right through the spot, and there was no prior seismicity to compare it to, because there had never been any. More than 50 felt quakes followed, topping out around magnitude 3.4, enough to rattle dishes and frighten people, not enough to knock down buildings. Injection at the well was halted in August 2009. Peer-reviewed studies concluded the sequence was almost certainly human-induced, and that conclusion helped rewrite how Texas and several other states regulate disposal wells. Then it got stranger. A follow-up study found that the earthquakes didn't stop when the injection stopped. They slowed down from roughly 23 events a month to about 1, but they kept happening for years afterward, and the magnitudes never really tapered. The fault, apparently, does not fully heal, and the science here honestly isn't settled. A separate swarm of quakes hit the town of Azle in 2013 and 2014 without a nearby injection well to blame. Only a small fraction of Barnett wells, on the order of 0.1%, have ever been linked to any felt shaking at all, which means the mechanism is real, but it's selective, and nobody can yet tell you with confidence which fault is listening and which one isn't. What is not in dispute is the headline: ground that had been silent since the Cretaceous started moving 6 weeks after we started pumping into it. So let's put the whole thing back together, because every piece of it points the same direction. Fort Worth is named for a general who died before the fort existed and never saw the site. Its signature slogan describes a line that runs through the middle of its rival city's football stadium. The Army built it, decided it was useless, and walked away after 4 years. And the city only survives because civilians moved into the empty barracks. The cowboy identity everyone associates with the place arrived 2 decades late, borrowed from a cattle trail that happened to pass by, and underneath that borrowed identity, a bulb burning since 1908, most of the nation's paper money, 80 unbroken years of building America's frontline warplanes, a Cold War role serious enough to put the city on a Soviet target list, an airport that took the Supreme Court to referee, and bedrock that had been asleep since the dinosaurs until we woke it up in 2008. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. We tend to assume the cowboy branding is a leftover, a bit of nostalgia a modern city hasn't gotten around to updating. I don't think that's right. I think the branding is the disguise. Fort Worth figured out early that if you tell people a simple, charming story about yourself, they will accept it and stop asking questions. And behind that story, for about a century now, this city has quietly been doing some of the most consequential work in the country, printing its money, building its aircraft, and holding down a spot in its nuclear posture, while tourists filmed longhorns walking down Exchange Avenue. The West may not begin in Fort Worth, but something a lot more interesting than the West has been happening there the whole time. If you want more of these, the places where the official story and the real one don't match, there are a couple on screen now, and subscribing means the next one finds you.